I want to welcome all of you who have joined us for today's Emerging Scholars Network conversation. We're glad that so many of you could be with us, and I know we still have perhaps more who will be joining us as well. My name is Bob Truby, and I serve as the National Director of the Emerging Scholars Network, a ministry of equipping and encouraging developing scholars who follow Jesus together. One of our major news stories of the past year has been the October 7th attack by Hamas on Israel, resulting in 1,139 deaths, followed by the massive Israeli response that has devastated Gaza at the cost of over 41,000 lives and over 90,000 wounded and counting. Those of us working on campuses have witnessed the conflict brought to the U.S. soil as we've seen protests by both Jewish and Palestinian students, encampments on campus, and in some cases arrests, and even university president resignations over the handling of these protests. Behind all of this is a cycle of injustices against Palestinians, retaliations, and oppression. Our guest today comes from a unique perspective as a Palestinian Christian. He offers this unique perspective living in the occupied territories of Palestine in Bethlehem, Palestine. And what he sees, and he'll be speaking and addressing today, I think some challenging things, including how the American church has actually contributed in some ways to the suffering of the Palestinian people. Before we get going here, we'll just take care of a couple of housekeeping things. We do record these conversations, and if you prefer not to be recorded or photographed, leave your mic muted, keep your video disabled, and by continuing to participate with this conversation, if your video is enabled or audio enabled after the recording begins, you consent to allow InterVarsity to use the recording, any screenshots of our conversation for InterVarsity ministry purposes. I'll stop for a moment here just to give you a chance to adjust your video and audio settings if you prefer not to be recorded. And I'd like to introduce our guest for the day. Reverend Dr. Munther Isaac has a PhD from the Oxford Center for Mission Studies. He's the academic dean of Bethlehem Bible College in Bethlehem, Palestine. And he's the director of Christ at the Checkpoint, a conference that has brought together different people concerned about peace in these lands. He's also the pastor of Christmas Evangelical Lutheran Church in Bethlehem, Palestine. He's the author From Land to Lands, From Eden to the Renewed Earth, a Christ-Centered Biblical Theology of the Promised Land. So, Dr. Isaac, we thank you so much for being with us today, especially given how much you have been traveling in recent days and weeks in speaking in the U.S. So thank you for taking the time to join us for this important conversation.
Thank you, Bob. And maybe as a matter of introduction, it's important to mention that I am a big product of the students ministry. It shaped my life, led me to study theology and into ministry. So student ministry is something that's so personal to me.
Well, for both of us, we have a lot of shared history in that regard. Well, you are in the midst of a speaking tour in the United States. And I wonder if in a few minutes you might summarize the message that you've been sharing with U.S. Christians about the situation in Palestine and how we both are involved and can respond.
Yeah, thank you. So I just actually concluded a 3 weeks speaking tour to the United States that took me to 10 different locations in 9 states. It was really overwhelming. And throughout, I spoke in churches and not just churches. For the last 10 months, actually, I have been speaking. And ever since in our church, Christmas Lutheran Church, we did something really pastoral in nature, which is place Jesus under rubble we see Jesus's image in every child in Gaza pulled from under the rubble. This is what we did. in December of last year, and it brought global attention. It gave me a broader platform to speak, not just to our people, but to the world. And since then, and even before, I've been advocating for a ceasefire, and even before that, for justice in Palestine. So that took me to different places, including, as you said, last 3 weeks in the United States. My message was simple, and maybe I can put it in threefold. Number one, I wanted to emphasize over and over again that from a Palestinian perspective, it's really important to understand that this war did not start on October 7th, that we must see and understand what happened on October 7th in context, in its wider context of 76 years of oppression against the Palestinians, of a very brutal system described by many, if not most, as an apartheid system, land confiscation, expelling of Palestinians from their land. So there is a context to this war, and explaining the context is but as Christians, we must see things in their context. And if you're really appalled by what happened on October 7th, my message is, why were you silent for the last 76 years? The only answer I could see is that to you, Jewish lives matter more than Palestinian lives, because we've been literally killed on a constant level, and pushed out of our land and persecuted, and the world was silent, maybe even approving. So we were, as we want to emphasize 70, the context of 76 years, we want to ask, why was the word silence? And all of a sudden, they're speaking. So this was my first message. The war did not start on October 7th. And my second message has to do with the role of church and theology. To begin with the role of theology, we all know that it's very common in Christian churches to support Israel. Yet, and especially in evangelical churches, and this goes beyond beliefs in the Bible that this is Jewish land according to these interpretations. God gave them to the Jewish people as an eternal possession. You have to bless Israel and so on. This is translated even beyond that to political positions and lobbying and giving money to Israel. So in one way, the churches, and especially the evangelical movement, to be honest, is very much complicit in this, in its support to Israel many times, and its unconditional support, without really realizing the consequences of that theology. And in doing so, they're imposing their own religion and faith on other peoples, and imposing religious beliefs that God gave this land to the Jewish people, and actually telling us that in Palestine, the reference point is not the international law, but the Bible. The Bible or sacred text decide who owns the land and who not. So from its inception, Israel relied on theology and religion to build its states. When we think of the idea of Zionism, Zionism is the creation of a homeland for the Jewish people. They chose Palestine to create their own homeland. The problem is that Palestine was not empty, but they chose Palestine because of biblical reasons, and Christians gave support. And what I keep saying over and over is that Christian Zionism is actually older than Zionism, and actually outnumbers Zionism. There are far more Christian Zionists than Jewish Zionists, far more. So I want to highlight the role of theology and religion, and then to emphasize that churches who are silent are actually complicit, especially given that this war in Gaza would stop next day if the United States stopped funding it, and if the United States Congress and presidency stopped giving it the political cover. So given that this war is literally being conducted through US money, tax money, and giving the political cover from the politicians of the United States, the silence of the church actually tells us that church leaders and faith leaders, I'm not just calling out Christians, by the way, everybody, you're okay with how your money is spent by giving weapons to Israel to conduct this genocide, and that you're okay with the way your political leaders act and decide and so on, because you elected them. So if you're not speaking out, that means you're okay with what's happening. So I want to say that the church is complicit in everything that's happening, and we need to hear your voices, especially when It's not just, 41,000 people have been killed. Total devastation of Gaza, many, many more under the rubble. The number is feared to be much more higher. Now we're talking about not just starvation, but diseases spreading. And more than 16,000, maybe 17,000 children have been killed. I mean, this is outrageous. 16,000 children in 10 months. Why is the silence of the world? If you're silent, that means you're okay with it. So I've been saying that. And the third message is that we're asking for a response. I said this is a Kairos moment. This is a moment for the church to take a stand. So much is at stake, given that this war is being broadcast live to the world. So much is at stake from for our collective humanity. Something is happening under our watch, and we're okay with it, the killing of children. And given that theology has been used, the church is silent, I think the silence of the church or not taking a stand is a stand in itself. So I've been saying it's the credibility of our Christian witness that is at stake. And throughout this war, I repeated, Gaza has become the moral compass of our world, given that it divided our world. And we need to know where people stand from what's happening, not just in the last 10 months, but from the systematic oppression and dehumanization of my people, the Palestinians, including those in Gaza, for the last 10 months. It's time to call things out, it's time to act, and it's time to take a position from what's happening in our land, from Zionism, its ideology of exclusion, supremacy, and from the overall reality in Palestine, that of apartheid, as attested by numerous, and I mean numerous, human rights organizations and legal organizations. I mean, if we as Christians are just okay with dismissing the international law and all these human rights agreements and values that we agreed upon in the last few years, if we as Christians are okay with that, then I don't know what to say. So this was my message.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, one of the things you've already mentioned is the 76-year history that preceded the current events. I wonder if you might talk a little bit more about some of the major things that have happened during those 76 years to the Palestinian people who were living on the land before 1948, when Israel became a state.
And not just living on the land, this has been our land for generations upon generations. This is the myth of an empty land that we continue to challenge. The land was never empty. People lived in the land for generations. So Israel was not created on an empty land. And what happened in 1948, and please understand, this is all documented history, is that 800,000 Palestinians, 800 were expelled from their lands, from their towns, from their villages. They were ethnically cleansed, then became refugees from Palestine, to the extent that 480 or 500 Palestinian towns and villages no longer exist. They were destroyed, removed from the face of the earth. Some of their ruins still exist, but Israel actually tried to, or have managed to, erase the ruins of other cities by planting trees or destroying them completely. So and by the way, it's now accepted in history, because it's just 80 years ago, friends, that this is what happened in Palestine was, purposeful, was a plan to empty Palestine from the Palestinians. Ethnic cleansing, it's a crime. Israeli historians have no problem, saying it. The word used then by the Zionists were forcible movement, just make them leave. Transfer, forcible transfer, I mean. That's the language the Zionists moved. Now it's more, accepted to talk about ethnic cleansing. Creating, a biggest problem with, and not only the refugees were kicked out, many Palestinians who at the time, because of the First and Second World War, were forced to leave Palestine to work elsewhere, were not permitted to return to their homes. They left their families to work, and then Israel prevented them from returning. So many lost their right to live in their own land. So Israel was established on 78% of the land. Later, it occupied the other 22% via its military and imposed a military occupation on the other 22%, and then began gradually building big cities, settlements, colonies, whatever you call them, at the heart of the West Bank, on land confiscated by from Palestinians and from Palestinian farmers and landowners, and building Jewish-only settlements on them. These settlements right now surround the Palestinian towns and cities. The number right now of Jewish settlers within the West Bank, so this is within the 22% that was left to the Palestinians, is close now to 800,000. Which is almost 1/3 of the Palestinian population. So they're in control right now of the majority of the West Bank. So they're in control of the majority of the 22% living in settlements, controlling the land and the roads around it. I mean, even as I speak, Israel is confiscating land. If you follow my social media, I posted about a Palestinian Christian family from the area of Bethlehem. Settlers simply want to take their land. They have papers. This is their land from generations. Settlers want to take it. The army kicked them out of it, and they're living in a tent outside of the... And you have to understand that even when Palestinians try nonviolent demonstrations, we're being shut down. No one listens to us. And that whole history, Bob, is not something that we as Christians were as if immune from. Everything that I described happened to Palestinians, including Palestinian Christians. So many refugees were Christians. Many Palestinian villages were destroyed. Churches were shut down after Israel was created. And today land is being confiscated from Christians. And in essence, Israel controls everything. And there is a system of discrimination by the Zionist movement, by its laws and its practice. I wish, if you want, I can give you what I mean by that. The laws that they have imposed, the practices on the ground, is a system that numerous human rights organizations have called a system of apartheid. Apartheid is not just something in South Africa. Apartheid is racial discrimination, not just constitutional, structural, and in practice. It's happening in Palestine. And in fact, Israeli human rights organizations agree on this. The world is silent, and the world has been silent. And then October 7th happened. I don't endorse violence. I don't support violence. But then October 7th happened. And you forget 76 years of violence against the Palestinians and just focus on October 7th. It made us angry. It really made me, as a man of faith, it made me angry.
I wonder if you might talk a little bit too. I think many people just hear the term Palestinian and equate Palestinian with Muslim. And yet there has been a robust community of Palestinian Christians that have occupied the land for centuries. Would you say a little bit about Palestinian Christians, of which you are one?
I mean, this is the land of Christ. Christianity started here. There has always been a Christian presence in this land. We're not just talking about history. We're talking about the longest ongoing Christian presence in the land. I mean, I'm writing right now about Gaza. Gaza converted, first to Christianity, even before, we're talking about the 4th century. And then officially, the beginning of the 5th century, the 400s. And since then, the Church of St. Porphyrius, which was born, by the way, has existed from the 4th century, 5th century. We're talking about one of the longest ongoing Christian presence in the world. And many times people focus on our numbers in the West Bank, which could be small because of the political reality people are living, but all over the world, there are Palestinian Christians. There are tens of thousands of Palestinian Christians around the world. The conflict is not religious in nature. It's not as if Jews and Muslims exist in the same land and cannot get along. The problem has roots. Palestinian Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived in this land for 2,000 years. I mean, Muslims, of course, came later in the 6th century, 7th century. But, for generations, Palestinian Christians, Muslims, and Jews. And there was actually aspirations for a binational Arab state entity that included Jews in the beginning. Zionism is what created all of this wedge. Zionism was the difference. It was the West that created a religious state in our region, the Zionism. I mean, if you think of it, this is what happened. So it's completely wrong to think of the conflict as religious, and it's completely wrong to think of Palestinians as only Muslims or as if this is a religious war.
Yes, thank you. I wonder if you might talk a little bit about what life, and maybe particularly even before this conflict, what life is like on a daily basis behind the wall and the checkpoints. What is the existence? What kinds of things happen for Palestinians living under these circumstances?
So let me focus about because it's a reality of fragmentation. Israel has managed to fragment the Palestinian communities into blocks, very crowded blocks, by the way. The most crowded one, the most densely populated one is Gaza. I don't know how much in feet square, but 360 kilometers square, 2 million people. It's hugely condensed. It's becoming like this in the West Bank, in areas like Nablus, like Jenin, like Tulkarem, definitely Bethlehem. When I say crowded, it's because Israel has prevented any natural growth by taking every land around us. So we live in very, suffocated communities. Everything around us is completely controlled by Israel, either the settlements or the separation wall or the roads. So they have besieged us. And every Palestinian town and city has very limited entry points and exit points that are fully controlled by Israel, checkpoint. So, for example, to leave the area of Bethlehem, where I am right now, and to go to the area of Ramallah, I would go through an Israeli checkpoint. I'm not even talking about going to to the Israeli side. I'm even talking about now going to the Palestinian side. And of course, when I drive in between the two Palestinian blocks, I drive on roads fully controlled by Israel. In some instances, they are shared with the settlers. In other instances, they are segregated. So the settlers wouldn't allow us to use their roads, and then the military creates other roads for us as Palestinians. And this created a lot of, delays on the checkpoints, crowded checkpoints, and harassment many times at the checkpoints. I mean, literally, when I was returning from the United States, I was stopped and harassed at the checkpoint going back to Bethlehem. In addition to the delay, and sometimes they close them. When they close the checkpoints, we become another Gaza, another siege, another blockade. Since October 7th, we've witnessed an increased violence by the Jewish settlers in the West Bank. It's now literally dangerous to travel from one Palestinian town to the other. Literally, it's very dangerous. We're afraid of the settlers. And one of my colleagues from the Bible College was stopped by settlers and Israeli soldiers. She said, they put the gun on her head like this, and her husband and her children was with her in the car. They forced them to return. When they returned, they found other settler crews throwing stones. They didn't know what to do. They were stuck. And then they just sped in front of the soldiers and escaped. I mean, they could have been killed easily, Bob, easily. And those are just Palestinians going to Ramallah to visit friends or family. So now we're thinking once or twice whether to, and the thing is, this violence is not checked. 3 days ago, 2 days ago, Israeli Jewish settlers in the West Bank, in Bethlehem, killed a Palestinian villager in his house. I mean, this is happening now. This is becoming daily routine, unfortunately. So as long as the settlers know they're not held accountable, given the fabric, the current Israeli government with its very, very right-wing ideology, and given that the international community is not willing to say anything or do anything, we're afraid for our lives, honestly.
Yeah, that's daily life for you. We're gonna just take a momentary break. We've been talking with Reverend Dr. Munther Isaac about his book, The Other Side of the Wall, as well as the current situation in Palestine. I'm just going to share screen for a moment to let you know how you can pick up a copy of his book. which goes into a lot more depth about some of the things we've been talking about, and other concerns as well. So the book is called The Other Side of the Wall, and it may be purchased at InterVarsity Press for 25% off with free shipping using the code IVPESN at checkout. And you can use that discount through September 4th, and you may apply it to not only your purchase of this book or maybe several copies of this book, but anything else that you order at InterVarsity Press. And I'll put that information in the chat for us. Okay, the other thing we want to do now is offer an opportunity for people to ask their questions. We don't have any in the chat yet, and so I'm going to go ahead while you're writing questions in the chat to offer one of the questions I have. And you've talked about particularly the Christian Zionism in the United States, the support of Israel, kind of the unqualified support for Israel and the belief in the land has been a significant part of what's enabled the kinds of things that have happened to Palestinian people. I wonder if you might talk for a lot of Christians I know, it is a sincere belief that God has prophesied that Israel would occupy the land. They saw the 1948 creation of the state of Israel as the fulfillment of prophecy. Were heartened by this, believe that somehow to bless Israel is to be part of the purposes of God, and believe in a continuing promise for the land for Israel. And I know you've written about this, and I wonder if you might be able to talk a little bit about what's mistaken about that idea, and perhaps the larger picture of what God has promised for Jewish people and for the world through Christ.
Yeah, and there's a whole multiple chapters in the book on this, the other side of the wall. Let me say this first. I'm an evangelical Christian, and as a Christian, I have a problem with that theology because it replaces the centrality of Christ with the centrality of Israel. Take, for example, the promise in Genesis 12, in you I will bless all the nations of the earth. Yes. The promise to Abraham. To me, this is a glorious promise of God's plan of salvation to humanity through his son, Jesus Christ, who, the son of Abraham, part of, he came from Israel, but as a savior to the world. And clearly, Paul in Romans says that the blessing of Abraham to the nations came through Christ. Now, please, how on earth did this become a formula for relating to a secular state today is beyond my comprehension. The way the Bible was weaponized, replacing the centrality of Jesus is, we've written answers, to me, I look at whole scripture through the lens of Jesus, which is what the New Testament did. Galatians 3:16 is very clear. Abraham did not have many offsprings as if in the plural. He had just one offspring, and that offspring is Jesus. So the story of Israel comes to Jesus. He is the appointed one. He is the chosen one. He is the one in whom all the promises of God finds their yes. All the plans of God for salvation and blessing become true. And not only that, Paul then says, if you are into Christ, you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. There is no Jew and Gentile. Ethnicity doesn't matter. There is no female or male. Gender doesn't matter. Free or slave, social status doesn't matter. We should remove all these distinctions that, in Christ we're all one. And to me, I'm still shocked by the fact that many Christians in the West continue to look at the reality here actually through ethnocentric lens. They look at the Jews as one group and then the Palestinians as one. They treat us as the children of Ishmael. They treat the Jews as the children of Abraham. And there is this assumption that Jews of today are all descendants of Abraham, which is historically, come on, read history. In fact, many Palestinians actually were Jews at some place. Many Muslims, many Christians were Jews. And by the way, does ethnicity matter? Does my DNA matter? It doesn't. It shouldn't. So I hope that this is the time. This is the time when Christians actually begin listening, to be honest, especially evangelicals, and ask yourself, I mean, are you listening to yourselves, what you're saying? Because this is the only context in the world, Bob. This is the only place in the world in which people look at the political reality and put aside the international law and think of what the sacred text said and to whom does it promise the land. I mean, do we accept this in any other context? Not only that, imagine if Muslims do it. Honestly, I was watching something which is related to universities, the discussion in the Congress when the president of Columbia Seminary was being interrogated in the Congress. And one congressman, I forgot the name, he actually pressured the president of Columbia and he said, do you want to be cursed by God? What? It's like, have you read Genesis 12? Because Genesis 12 says if you go against the Jewish people, God will curse you. So do you want to be cursed by God? This is how he even viewed the demonstrations in the universities. I mean, I was shocked. This is a congressman. This is not John Henge or Pat Robertson. This is a congressman. I mean, imagine if Ilhan Omar said, do you want to be cursed by Allah? Have you read the Quran? Imagine if she said that. The whole world will go crazy. The whole America will go crazy. So somehow the way religion is imposed in this context. And by the way, I mean, again, I wish people listen because we've been, everything, we've been as Palestinians many times accused, and those who support us, anti-Semitism. Of course, anti-Semitism is evil, is wrong. But I ask myself, are you listening to those evangelical pastors, what they're saying? Someone sent me a clip yesterday of John MacArthur, who said openly, Jews are under divine judgment. If I say that today as a Palestinian, what I will be called. And he said, 2/3 will be judged. And he said, we don't know if this will be the final judgment. Maybe God will judge them again through Iran. I couldn't help him saying that. And then, of course, in some dispensational views, 2/3 of the Jews will be killed, and the other third will convert to Christianity. So I can't, you're cheering the presence of Jews in Palestine. You're cheering the establishment of Israel because even though you believe that 2/3 of those Jews will be massacred, and the other third then will convert to Christianity. I mean, it's time, really. It's time we put aside, get rid of this Christian Zionist theology. It's so damaging to the Christian witness, to the gospel witness. It's not helping, it's not bringing peace whatsoever. It's damaging to the humanity to the extent that people see the death of children in Palestine or even in Israel, and all they think about is the end times. I mean, seriously? We should weep for those killed. We should weep for those killed, not get excited about the second coming and the end times.
Thank you. Let's see, also in the chat, let me pull up this comment here. Scott has observed that you have been involved some with the fellowship of the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students, and there's a ministry of IFES in the West Bank. And I wonder if you might say and InterVarsity is actually one of the member movements of IFES. I wonder if you might say something about the IFES ministry in the West Bank, both in the past and right now.
For many years, there was actually, let's be clear, a strong Christian ministry among students in Palestine, in different Palestinian universities. Sometimes it was stronger in the south than in the north, like in Bethlehem. Other times it was stronger in Birzeit University, where I studied when I studied their engineering. Definitely it was strong then. It continued, and then honestly, we've been through many challenges. Some challenges after COVID, not just related to COVID, but related to some of our staff, and that stopped. And since then, we haven't been able to resolve some of the challenges. And as a result, the ministry is still on a pause. Some of my friends are trying to revive the Palestinian branch. The IFES, of course, in the Middle East and North Africa is very involved, very active in Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, even Syria. And sometimes we send friends there from Palestine. But for the last few years, 2-3 years, it's been on hold until we hopefully resolve some of the administrative issues. But COVID wasn't good, to be honest, as well. Church ministry and any ministry in Palestine these days, and even before the war, is challenging. The fragmentation, the constant pauses in life. By that I mean, violence stops everything, war stops everything. Classes in these days are, even in schools where I supervise many high schools, sometimes it's online, sometimes it's not online, nothing is guaranteed. My wife goes to university now. She's doing her master's degree. Sometimes it takes her 4 hours to get to university. Sometimes she misses class. She goes and she can't get there. Every class they have to check, is it happening virtual or in person? Is it safe to come to university? Is it not safe? And so on. Nothing is stable for the last 3-4 years in Palestine, but much more so for the last year.
Donald asks the question of what is the excuse that Israel has given to the world over its decades of stringent control of Palestinians in the occupied territories? Is it fear of terrorism, the memory of earlier attacks, the wars that have occurred? How does Israel justify these things?
Well, there is definitely the self-defense. It's one of the, Israeli thinker and journalist Gideon Levy said, Israel is the only occupier in world history that portrays itself as the victim. There is definitely the conscious, the guilt among many Christians from the horrors of the Holocaust. But then there is something much, much deeper. And you have to understand it, because it's not as if the international community, especially leaders, are not aware of Israel's policies. They support them, they fund them. Israel serves the interest of the United States and the Western Empire. It's very clear. Someone like Joe Biden is famous for saying, if Israel did not exist, we would have to create it to be almost like the military base or the extension of the United States in the Middle East. The amount of strong ties economically, the weapon industry, at the end of the day, all of this money that's sent to Israel is money spent in the United States. The fact that is, America continues its control of the Middle East through the presence of Israel. All of it is related. The same with the United Kingdom. So we will be fooled if we don't see the importance of Israel for the interest of the United States. A friend of mine who has been advocating for Palestine for years, actually American Christian, and he's appalled by his government's position. And he had the opportunity once to meet with a senior US leader in the Middle East as part of a Christian delegation. And that leader told him something very important. He said, you're appealing to morality and ethics, and this is the wrong appeal. The United States in the Middle East doesn't function based on what's right and what's wrong. It functions on what's best for the United States. So as long as the United States is not convinced that creating a Palestinian state serves its best interest, or that, you know, Israel is serving their best, and nothing will change. So if you as Christians want to change your government's positions, you have to appeal to what's best for it. I mean, honestly, this is the logic of empire. Uh, uh, and this is why all of this continued. In this war in particular, I've added another dimension, and I'm convinced that many in the Western world simply don't look at us as equal. Racism is real. They continue to justify the killing of Palestinians, rationalize it, using arguments like human shields and so on. They don't look at Palestinians really as equal. I mean, we're convinced of that. No one can argue with me on this matter that world leaders do not see us as equals. I mean, this is the whole land without people. Land without people is not an empty land. Land without people is land without people of equal worth to us. So this is what the whole concept of land without people means.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I would encourage you, we have a few more minutes for some questions, but you know, you mentioned the treatment of Palestinians as this idea of human shields, you know, which is a depersonalizing term. But, you know, and I think there are many people who actually are deeply concerned about Palestinians, are deeply convinced of the injustices that Israel has brought, but also are concerned about the presence of Hamas and some of the ways that during the war that they've taken refuge while the people have been exposed, that you know, in ways that Hamas has also contributed in some ways. And I wonder if you might say something, you know, if you can say anything about that, because I think that's a legitimate concern that many people do have.
The human shields.
Well, it's the fact that there are many civilians, obviously, who have died in these things, and often have not had access to some of the refuges from reports we've had that the Palestinian leaders of Hamas have had.
Well, the problem is there is nowhere to hide. The West Bank is,
Yeah.
the Gaza is very densely populated, and literally there is no. And every time they tell them to move to one place, they move to it. Then they tell them to move. I mean, some people have moved 4 or 5, 6 times since the beginning of this war, from one tent to the other, from one area to the other. The Hamas commandment is most likely, from what we hear, is underground, in tunnels. The bombing has been described by so many people as indiscriminatory,
Mm-hmm.
by many officials, not just Palestinians, by many journalists, and, you know, by many observers. And the idea of, as happened, I think I was in the States, of shelling a whole school and killing refugees in it, including many children, because Israel suspected or alleged, or if it was proved that there was Palestinian militants in that area, is appalling. Appalling that this is actually being circulated as a valid excuse. Because if a serial killer, Bob, escapes and takes 100 children as hostages in a school in Ohio, would you advocate for bombing the school so that we get rid of the serial killer and then blame the serial killer for doing this?
Mm-hmm.
Really? Is this what you're saying? And if you know, you might say so in one case, if we are not talking about people, if we're talking about animals, and actually maybe then animal rights group will protest. So this whole idea that blaming Hamas for hiding behind, you know, by the international law, unless it doesn't count, tell us. If the international law does not matter, tell us. The international law states that humans are protected under, you know, so I mean civilians. So even if Israel's allegations are true that Hamas is hiding behind these civilians, That doesn't give Israel the right to bomb the civilians to kill those Hamas militants. And one final word that I've noticed in this war and even beyond, I'm surprised by how much credible people take the words of Israeli politicians and the Israeli military. I mean, as someone who lives in this land, Israeli politicians lie all the time. Israeli military lies all the time. Never does the Western media suspect anything they say. If they say it, that's true, which shocks me. I mean, they would tell you we don't target civilians. Today, they tell you we don't target civilians. They've killed at least 40,000 people, but they don't target civilians. Honestly, 16,000 children. Honestly, you don't target civilians. So, I mean, come on. Would somebody please call them out? So this is one thing. I see, yeah.
Well, we are out of time for some questions. What I want to do now is to give you an opportunity, kind of your final or closing words of in any ways that you would speak to us. Particularly, I hope that you might share some of what you would ask of American Christians, including the students, faculty, and university staff who are on this conversation.
Final words. My final word is that it's overdue for Christians in the United States to re-examine the whole way they have looked at the situation in Palestine, the attitudes, the way they talked about Palestinians, the theology that erased Palestinians, completely erased Palestinians, theology books that gave the impression that Israel was created on an empty land, attitudes shaped that looked at Palestinians as descendants of Ishmael or the Canaanites, and ignored the rich history of Palestine and the many people and civilizations that came and went and so on. And the way they have caused so much damage to the credibility of the Christian witness in the Middle East. I mean, just recently, even Arab church leaders made a letter to evangelical Christians saying that there's clearly a gap. We're one in the body of Christ. We're serving the same Christ, but there's a gap in how we think. And that gap is making us challenges, namely how Christians support Israel and how evangelicals. This obsession with end times has to stop. And the church must reclaim its role as not just calling for peace and seeking peace, but also advocating for justice and righteousness and saying truth, calling truth. I think many times in the name of making peace, we don't call out the oppressors. We don't speak truth to power. We just try to be peaceful or neutral. That's also something that frustrated me over the years. So this is a plea. It could be through reading the book first and getting introduced to our community, our position, listening to Palestinian Christian theologians, prayers, sermons. We have not been silent, friends. The question is, are you listening? And I am speaking, it's 10 p.m. right now. I might be quiet and tired, but the topic at mind is so urgent. People are being killed. God knows how many people were killed by the time we finish this. A lot of it is done in our name, in the name of the Bible. For me as a Christian, there is an existential threat. This is so serious to us. And so this is not just a call for an engagement over coffee. This is something serious, especially given that the way theology has been used. And I want to, because it's in the question, Islamic extremists are definitely a problem. the challenge is you have to see them in context of occupation and apartheid. Every occupation has a resistance. We have been advocating for nonviolence resistance. So have many Muslims. But then there are also some extreme groups, for sure. But they are not the main challenge, believe me. I mean, this might sound radical to you. The real issue began when Palestinians were expelled, and this was never corrected in 1948. And then since then, we have been under a strict oppression, occupation, apartheid. And I'm very sometimes, especially in Christian evangelical circles, I'm very cautious, if you wish, given that, yes, again, I don't support Islamic extremism, and they don't represent all Palestinians. Many of my Palestinian Muslim friends actually support nonviolence and so on. But when people ask me this, I wonder, maybe we need to be honest with ourselves and look at the mirror. By that, I mean, just go 80 years in history and ask yourself, who was it that slaughtered 6 million Jews? Was it Islamic radical groups? Or was it baptized European Christians with suits and ties and technology? Please. The way many Christians talk about Islamic radicalism gives the impression that we Christians are the most peaceful people. I mean, even in this war, we're funding it. So it's time for really an honest assessment. Again, I'm against all sorts of violence. I'm against all sorts of religious extremism. Israel is literally controlled by religious extremists. Why aren't we calling it out? Why is the only question about Islamic extremism and not about Jewish extremism? Or for that matter, Christian extremism? And I feel that we have created this narrative in which the Judeo-Christian tradition is the self-righteous one, is the advanced human freedom, liberty, and Islam and the Arabs are the evil side. And I asked myself, just read history, and you'll get to understand. So, yes.
Dr. Isaac, thank you so much for being with us. We're so thankful for the opportunity to have your voice heard. It's a voice that often hasn't been heard in a variety of circles, and we're very grateful for you taking the time today to speak to us and to help us to understand the situation behind the wall. We do want to just mention one more time Dr. Isaac's book, The Other Side of the Wall. The information is in the chat for how you might purchase it. And this discount's going to be good through September 4th and might be applied to your whole order. Finally, I just want to share a personal word. It's really been my joy and deep privilege to work with students and faculty with InterVarsity for the last 48 years. The last 5 of those with the Emerging Scholars Network. This Saturday is going to be my last day with InterVarsity. It's officially called retirement, but I think of it as redeployment in the Lord's service. I am so thankful for the host of students, faculty, colleagues, and ministry partners that I've been blessed to work with. And to all of you who have joined us for these conversations over the last 5 years. On September 1st, Jamie Noyd will become the new director of the Emerging Scholars Network. And if you haven't already joined ESN, I hope you will go to blog.emergingscholars.org and do so to see all the exciting places Jamie will take ESN. So I want to thank again Dr. Isaac today for being with us and taking time at a late hour in his day. For all of you who have joined us today for this conversation. And I want to say a special word of thanks to Krista Clayton at InterVarsity Press, who has worked with us these past 5 years in scheduling and setting up these conversations. Thank you all very much, and have a great rest of your day.